U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Warsaw today following a visit to Kyiv, where he discussed ongoing military support for Ukraine. The trip coincides with broader diplomatic activity across Europe and comes ahead of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the United States later this month. Key topics include military aid, defense cooperation, and regional security. Joining us today on TVP World to break down these developments is Daniel Fried, former U.S. ambassador to Poland. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
For having me.
Sir, can you help us understand why do you think Blinken is visiting Ukraine right now and Poland just before Zelensky's trip to the United States?
The Secretary of State is visiting Poland because Poland is a frontline country, a leading voice in Europe, and a leading power in Europe with respect to resisting Russian aggression against Ukraine. Secretary Blinken went with his British counterpart to Kyiv to both show the Ukrainians that we stand with them and support them, and to discuss current developments in the war and the nature of U.S. assistance.
And
this was an important trip.
There's been a flurry of visits by European leaders around Ukraine. Do you think that's a sign of some serious peace talk that might materialize?
I see no evidence that Russia is interested in peace talks on anything but its own maximalist terms. Russia would be happy to discuss terms of Ukraine's surrender, but that is not what we're interested in. There's nothing wrong with negotiations, but there's something wrong with dumb negotiations, and it would be dumb to start negotiations with Russia based on their position. I think that the activity around Ukraine has to do with developments in the war, the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk Oblast, Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which are serious, and the ongoing discussion in the United States and among allies as to what, if any, restrictions should be placed on Ukraine's use of weapons to defend itself.
All right. So when it comes to the timing, do you think that this sense of urgency in these diplomatic moves is also due to the potential for a change in U.S. administration?
Well, there was, for Polish listeners who follow U.S. politics and who watch the debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, a rather strong difference between the two candidates. Vice President Harris took the position that support for Ukraine is in the U.S. national interest. She was channeling, if I may say so, her inner Harry Truman with a little bit of Ronald Reagan. What Trump was doing, I cannot really say, except he would not commit to supporting a Ukrainian victory. He said repeatedly that he wants peace between Ukraine and Russia. Well, peace is a good thing, but not if it is on Russia's terms. That is not the advice that, say, we should have given Great Britain in 1940 to seek peace with Hitler. So I think that there is a great deal of concern in Ukraine and in Europe about the outcome of the U.S. elections. And I think it is important to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position before those elections.
Right, and speaking of the United States, we do know that Zelensky will be visiting the U.S. soon. With all this you just mentioned on the horizon, what do you think the president's approach is going to be?
Well, I think that Zelensky will ask for a maximum amount of U.S. support, and I think it would be wise for either him or certainly members of his delegation to seek out meetings with Republicans. It's a standard practice for foreign delegations to look at the American opposition as well as the American government, and I think this is not a bad idea.
All right. We're also looking at some of the announcements made by Blinken. He's made some sort of vague hints at possibly allowing Ukraine to use these long-range weapons to hit inside Russia. Do you think we can expect that to materialize during Zelensky's visit in the States?
Now, that is a very good and timely question. Secretary Blinken certainly did make hints in that direction. But as far as I know, no U.S. administration decision has been made. My sense of it is that the administration is still debating this issue. And for what it's worth, my own view is that we should stop being public about our restrictions on Ukraine. The only restriction that we should declare is that Ukraine is bound by the laws of war. After that, Ukraine's use of its own weapons should, of course, be something we are discussing with Ukraine all the time to see what makes the most sense. But the idea that we would draw a line and say this weapon, but thus far, but no farther, makes little sense.
Right, that's essentially giving all our strategic maneuvers away to the Russians.
Well, we should not be putting down red lines or conditions for Ukraine. They are bound by the laws of war. After that, it's perfectly reasonable for the United States to have serious discussions with Ukraine about what use of weapons makes the most sense. But it's a tactical mistake as well as a strategic one for the United States to start talking about this publicly.
Right, and speaking of the situation between Ukraine and Russia, this offensive in Kursk has dented Russia's war narratives. Do you think that might soften up the U.S.'s side a little bit when it comes to restricting Ukraine, as some of these previously considered red line have already been crossed, and, well, it didn't really escalate into something that the States has been worried about?
I think that fears of Russian escalation have usually been exaggerated. That is not to say that such fears have no basis or that there is zero risk, but the risk of Russian escalation is limited. The Russians are already acting against NATO countries. They're engaged in cyber attacks and physical sabotage. There are other areas in which the Russians could escalate and damage U.S. interests, but we should not be paralyzed by that. It is important to help Ukraine win the war, to prevail. In his press conference today with Secretary Blinken, Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski was spot on, absolutely right, when he said that Russia could lose. They lost the Crimean War, they lost World War I to Germany, they lost the Afghan War. And after each loss, there was domestic upheaval and sometimes reform inside Russia. So Russia is not unbeatable. And quite frankly, our problems get better the better Ukraine is doing in this war. And we ought to be helping them.
Right. You mentioned that some of these kind of escalation fears is a little bit overblown, but we are still seeing the West putting some of these restrictions on Ukraine. What are some of the reasons why Ukraine is still being held back?
Well, as I said, some of this might have to do with fears of escalation. And some of it may have to do with the sense that this or that use of a U.S. weapon is not the best use of that weapon. Now, that's a discussion that should happen in private. And I think the public discussion of limitations imposed by the U.S. on Ukraine has no good purpose. It simply gives the Russians an opportunity to try to manipulate us. So I would like to see this cleared off the public agenda entirely. I would like, if I had a magic wand loaded with a wish, I would say that the United States should impose only one condition on Ukraine for the use of the weapons, that the use of that weapons be consistent with the laws of war. After that, things should be discussed in private between Ukraine and the United States, and with the full knowledge that Ukraine ultimately is responsible for the decisions.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for watching this edition of World News Tonight. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.